I was born and raised on the farm that I live on today, and I officially started farming in 1979, but I fell off the horse the first time when I was 3 years old, and I was milking cows when I was 4, so that's probably when I started farming. My father died in 1981. He had leukemia, lymphoma, and cancer of the bone marrow. I had everything arranged or agreed upon and to take over the operation from him. And he passed away a month after my wife and I got married. And then came along the farm crisis of the 80s. Some of you may have heard of that, some not. That was a lot of fun. We were just getting back on our feet, and 1988 we had a drought. That was a lot of fun. 1989, I started using what was known at that time as alternative farming methods on our family farm. Today we refer to it as, one of the references is biological crop production. In 1989, I became a student of the soil. I have absolutely no problem admitting the more I learn and the more I know I don't know. The good Lord has given us an amazing creation to work with. And when we in our very limited capacity and understand part of it, it's kind of like looking through a door that's very open just a little bit, and you're way far away from it, and it's a small light, and as you get closer, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as you're peering through there, it turns into such a vast discovery that's nonstop. And it's fun. You get something new every day. We started in 89. We were fully implemented in 1990, 91. 92, I decided to start sharing this information and products with other farmers that were interested. That's when I began the crop nutrition advisory work that I continue to do to this day. And I can tell you, I've been blessed in so many ways I can't count it, to work with family farmers all across our country. And the work that we have done in crop and livestock production, focusing on alternative methods to do everything we can to get away from toxins and away from dependence on antibiotics. And a lot of what we learned and what we saw caused us to pay closer and closer and closer attention. Well, 1994, we heard about the promise of genetically modified organism crops. And I'll refer to it both as GMO, genetically modified organism, or genetic engineering. It's basically one and the same thing. The promise was a tremendous draw. And I started studying what I could find about it online and through different mechanisms. And it sounded a little bit too good to be true. As soon as we could research it on our farm, we started to research it and put it to the test. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. The things that we have seen at the farm level. Hopefully you'll have a basic understanding of how it is designed and how it's working to this point in time. And the thing that really brought it all together was when the good Lord saw fit to connect me with all of these scientists, or most all of them. I have had the privilege and the tremendous pleasure of working with the majority of these in some capacity. There's a couple that I only reference their work, which is done cohesively with some other members on this team. Everyone on this list believes in the potential of the technology of genetic engineering. The potential will be tremendous when The technology is refined and perfected and implemented with the desired goals that are stated by those who are purporting it. And that'll make more sense to you by the end of the presentation. I will take all questions that anyone will have at the end of the presentation to kind of keep the flow going. You know, jot your questions down. I won't leave until I answer the question. If I don't know the answer, I'll absolutely tell you I don't know, but I will take all questions. Some examples of a GMO. One of the first examples of genetic engineering to enter the food supply in the United States was known as RBGH or RBST. This is a genetically engineered growth hormone that was developed to be injected into lactating milk cows. This genetically engineered hormone mimics a natural hormone that is naturally present in the cow. So they can't differentiate as to whether or not it was actually in the milk. And yet, the natural hormone didn't come with the side effects that this one did. The United States is the only country in the world that really allowed the use of this product. I remember when they did the safety testing on it in Canada, the first thing they required was the safety testing on the cows themselves. And the safety testing verified the fact that when the cows were injected with this, they had increased infection in their udder, mastitis. They had problems with the health of their feet. And they didn't breed back well. The conception rates were down. They had to take them off of the hormone in order to get the conception because it was messing with the natural processes. There were a number of independent scientists that also voiced a concern that said this could be detrimental for women because of the potential changes in the progesterone and estrogen levels that could be in the milk as a result of this tinkering that was being done. There was never a full safety test conducted on that, but I can tell you that because of the concerns of the consumer in our country, the vast majority of the fluid milk today comes from cows that do not receive this any longer. Now, it's still in the system. There are ice cream products and cheese and butter and dairy products that are in the system that come from cows that have been injected with this. And from the dairy farmer's standpoint, it's a benefit to him when those cows produce more milk. Of course, they had to deal with those side effects I mentioned, but the farmers are always challenged with the break-even or making money, so any shortcut that might be presented looks like a positive. Bacillus thuringiensis is a natural occurring soil bacterium. The natural version of BT, organic farmers have used for many, many years. They could spray it on their crop when they had an infestation of certain pests. The corn borer would ingest this BT toxin. This toxin eats a hole in their gut and they die. The toxin then returns to the soil in a benign manner and is no longer threatening. With genetic engineering, they are trying to mimic this, but they're doing it differently. They develop different strains of this BT toxin and they inject it into the plant so it's expressed in every cell of that plant. It's not like a pesticide that is sprayed on that can be washed off. It is in every single cell of the plant. Another example of this in-plant insecticide is known as CRW. It was specifically designed to help control corn rootworm. There are further versions of the BT and the CRW for differing insects that continue to come up as a problem in crop production as the insects are adapting to these unnatural alterations in the crop. Herbicide tolerance is the #1 most widely adapted form of genetic engineered crop use in the world. The herbicide tolerance means they can insert a trait or a characteristic into this crop. Now we can spray a herbicide on there, for example, a glyphosate-based herbicide. Glyphosate is the active chemical ingredient in Roundup herbicide, the most widely used herbicide in the world. By having that herbicide tolerance in that plant, that enables them to spray that crop with this herbicide that's designed to kill everything it touches. The crop survives and the weeds are gone. So to the farmer, it was a tremendous drawing card. It looked like a simplistic, easy, fast, simple way to go. We have glyphosate-resistant soybeans, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa in production in the United States today. There's also something known as Liberty Link corn. The Liberty Link corn has a different active ingredient than glyphosate. It's glufosinate. The chemistry is slightly different, but the approach of the herbicide is the same. It's designed to kill everything it touches, with the exception of the genetically engineered crop that's designed to withstand it. The goals of genetic engineering, the #1 goal that we've been told is to increase the yields of the crop to feed the world's growing population. I doubt that anybody would argue with that as being a novel goal. Another goal that we have been told is we're going to improve the nutrient content of the crop so that we can hopefully solve some of the illness issues, and in the case of the improved nutrient content, the poster child of this has been the golden rice. Well, this has been talked about from day one. It still is not developed and finalized and in production. The golden rice, the objective was to increase the vitamin A content of that crop, and that by doing so, then this would enable us to introduce that rice to the poor countries where rice is a staple crop, and as a result, this should help subside some of the blindness in the poor children. Well, there's three things actually on the golden rice that we have to analyze a little bit from this perspective. #1, they did slightly increase the vitamin A content in the rice. But you need to consume 20 to 25 pounds of rice per day in order to get the vitamin A level that they're purporting that this is going to solve the problem. The golden rice has not performed agronomically. It does not compare with the conventional varieties that the farmers are currently using, so it's not going to have an appeal for them to want to use. The other thing that's happening, the mothers in the third world country of these children do not want anything to do with it because they have not conducted transparent safety testing on whether or not it would have an adverse effect to the children. And I guess I can't blame them for not wanting their children to be used as guinea pigs. We're also told we will have drought tolerance with genetic engineering. The in-plant insect protection with the BT and CRW, the goal of that is to reduce insecticide use, and I don't think anybody would argue with that approach. The herbicide tolerance, the goal of that is to reduce herbicide use, improve weed control. As I mentioned, this absolutely happened in the beginning. So let's review some of what has taken place. As far as increased yield, in the very early years of the introduction of the genetically engineered crops, our land-grant universities had access to the seed. They could have the conventional variety and the genetically engineered variety to put into test plots and do comparisons. Today, they don't have that capability because of the restrictive language on the technology agreements by the company that owns the patent on that seed. The researchers cannot access it without express written consent. We know of more than one instance where the research has not come out advantageous towards the genetically engineered crop, and the researchers are not allowed to release that data. But in the early days, when it was allowed to compare, there was something come to be known as yield drag. The University of Nebraska had multi-year testing to document this. The conventional soybean was traditionally yielding more than the genetically engineered. It was an 8 to 10% yield drag. The Union of Concerned Scientists in 2009 studied all of the data that they could access that was conducted at the research level in them early years. And they put out a report entitled Failure to Yield. They documented the fact that as much as 93% of the time the genetically engineered would yield less. Sometimes it was the same, and 1 or 2% they would see increases. On our farm in northwest Iowa, we had access to BT corn for the first time in 1997. The seed company provided this seed for the test plot. We have never signed a technology agreement for any genetically engineered seed. And we put this in a plot side by side, and it's very fine print. You probably can't see it from the back, but I'll explain the important parts. Our old reliable hybrid was Golden Harvest 2390. We put that in the field, and right next to it we put the BT version. Our seed cost was over $10 an acre higher for the BT. The yield of the conventional was 149 and the BT was 146, so it was 3 bushels less. But the biggest difference that year was the moisture difference. The harvest moisture of the BT was 5 percentage points wetter. As a result, that cost us money. You have to take a dock on that moisture when you sell that grain, and it cost us 25 cents a bushel. So the end result was we lost $57.99 an acre as a result of using that BT. We also did another little experiment with that corn that first year. We had heard from the early use of BT in Nebraska that the cattle shied away from the BT stalks and the BT corn. So we took some of the conventional corn and some of the BT and put it in the opposite ends of the feed bunk, and we turned a couple cows in there. They consumed all of the conventional corn, and they smelled the BT and walked away from it. That's not normal for a cow. The following year, we repeated this test plot. We got the seed again from the seed company. We had the conventional and the BT. Again, $10 an acre difference in seed cost, with the BT being higher. The moisture was pretty close to the same that year, but the conventional yielded 167 bushels per acre, and the BT only made 140. Well, back in those days, corn was only $1.80 a bushel, so that calculated into a $58.95 per acre loss. This was one of our old reliable favorite hybrids. It was really bred well. The plant breeders did a super job of dotting their I's and crossing their T's. If you do a good all-around job of developing a hybrid, it will have natural pest tolerance in it in a big way. This hybrid had natural resistance and tolerance to corn borer, and the BT didn't pay. The seed company had other hybrids who some of my customers referred to as corn borer magnets. And it kind of made you wonder, did the plant breeder dot the last I and the last 3-4 T's, or did they take a shortcut? If they put the BT into that type of hybrid, they would see a 10 or 15, maybe even 20 bushel yield increase, depending on the year and the amount of pressure you had from the insects. If they had a shorter path to take to get it to market, and a little higher price seed which improved their margin, which one do you think they may be promoted? Herbicide use rates. As I said, glyphosate tolerant crops are the #1 used herbicide tolerant crops in the world. Roundup herbicide was the only option for this in the beginning. 1974 was when Roundup was introduced and patented as a herbicide. In 1994, that patent wore off, so they have 20 years protection. Once that happened, then there were all sorts of generic versions that came into being. The original use rate of that original formulation is 32 ounces per acre. That's what was used in the beginning. The farmers didn't use a pre-emerge and a post-emerge herbicide. They, in many cases, if they were tilling, they would make a simple tillage pass prior to planting, plant the crop came up, they sprayed the crop and the weeds all died, and life was good. Herbicide was cheaper in the beginning. By 2010, with continued use of this same herbicide, the weeds were becoming harder and harder to kill. In 1996, I knew of farmers in west central Ohio that were applying 96 ounces of a glyphosate-based herbicide in a single application and would put 2 to 3 of those applications on some soybean fields to try and control weeds that they were not able to kill. Dr. Charles Benbrook from your state did a study. He looked at the records and he looked at all of the pesticide use in our country before the introduction of genetically engineered crops up to and through that 13th year. Over that 13-year time period, overall in the country, there was a 1/4 pound per acre increase in overall pesticide use. But in the 13th year, he looked at the conventional crop and the genetically engineered version, and there was a 26% increase between the two in that year. Because as we went forward, the need for more pesticide continued to increase. He then did a 16-year that looked at from start to finish, and that gave us a 7% increase of total pesticides in the country. In Argentina, they introduced the glyphosate-resistant soybeans in 1996. They were using 2 liters per hectare. By 2010, they were up to as high as 20 liters per hectare because they could not control the weeds. The insecticide use before genetically engineered crops were introduced, there was no such thing as an insecticide treatment on corn and soybean seed. The soybeans came, as we would know, as naked seed today with no treatment on it. The corn had just a mild fungicide treatment on it. Today, it is just about impossible to get a genetically engineered seed in corn or soybeans without a neonicotinoid insecticide treatment on it. The neonicotinoid insecticides are systemic. That insecticide will be in the plant after it sprouts and grows from that seed, and any insect that may feed on that plant in a 3 to 4 month time period is at risk. Neonicotinoids have been banned in several of the European Union countries because of the direct scientific proof that they are contributing significantly to the colony collapse disorder in honeybees. There is also research being done now that's looking at glyphosate as being a significant culprit in colony collapse disorder. What about the problem insects that we were going to control? This is a picture of a corn plant. You see the leaves and the stalk. Here's the emerging ear, but there is no silk coming out the top of that ear. The reason for that, these are adult rootworm beetles. The adult rootworm beetle lays the egg for the rootworm larva. We all know the chicken came before the egg, so that's why I start with this one. The larva will be in the soil, or the egg will be in the soil. When the soil warms up enough, the egg hatches, then the larva comes out and chews on the roots of that corn. As you can see, this corn is not standing up. The reason it's not standing up is because it has no root system. That rootworm larvae have chewed off the roots, and the corn is suffering dramatically. After they go through their stage as a larva, they advance to the adult beetle. They go through a cocoon state. They come out as the adult beetle. If they chew all the silk off, then it can't catch the pollen. With no pollen, all you get is a cob. There's no grain to harvest. There are CRW resistant, that's the term for the in-plant genetically engineered insecticide. There are CRW-resistant rootworm in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Illinois. There was just another article in Reuters published the 28th of August, further documenting how widespread this has become in Illinois. The farmer, their corn is literally severely damaged as a result of these bred-up insects. In our part of Iowa, a lot of the farmers have recognized that this trait is failing. So they have gone back to applying the in-furrow insecticide when they plant the crop, and in many cases they're applying higher rates than what we ever did before because of the resilience of the insect. So what is the motivation? Is it to grow more food? Is it to enhance the nutrient content of the crop? Technology fees are the royalties that the seed companies collect on every single bag of genetically engineered seed that a farmer purchases to raise a crop. He pays that royalty on every bag of seed every year. In the beginning, I showed you the BT, and that difference was approximately $10 per acre. That changed. By 2010, it had escalated to quite a level. And it hasn't slowed down tremendously since then, but in 2010, I thought, I'm going to sit down and figure this out. I presumed, you notice I said presume, not assume, I presumed that all of the acres in the U.S. would be planted to the latest and greatest technology seed for corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, and sugar beets. And I figured those tech fees based on the planting rate in the given crops. Now, the planting rate was in the 80 to 90 percentile range, so my numbers are going to be a little bit high. But again, to have consistency, I wasn't going to guess at the planting rate. I just said, what if we planted 100%? That year in corn, we had 87.9 million acres of corn. The technology fee, or the royalty per bag of corn, amounted to $60 per acre. The seed cost was only $40 per acre. So figuring that, at 87.9 million acres, that generated 100% of the acres again being planted, $5,274,000,000 tech fee. Soybeans, we had 78.9 million acres. The tech fee rate was $24 per acre. That was just under $1.9 billion tech fee. Cotton, we only had 10.9 million acres, and the tech fee was $78 an acre, so that added $850 million. The history on cottonseed, I had the good pleasure of working in Georgia from 2010 to 2012 with cotton producers, and I learned a lot. In 1993, a 50-pound bag of cottonseed, the retail price was $45 to $60 per bag. In 2010, they no longer sold a 50-pound bag of cottonseed. They're selling 230,000 seeds per bag, and that bag would weigh from 38 to 46 pounds depending on the size of the seed. Here's the breakdown on the price. The seed cost is $159.99 per bag. The technology fee is $412.20 per bag. The seed treatment is $125 per bag. This is a combination of insecticide and fungicide and pneumaticide that they have to have on the seed because they have damaged so many of the beneficial attributes in the soil. They have every seed-borne pest and fungal disease attacking the plants, and they have to use the toxins to protect them. The total retail price then is $697.19 compared to $60 in 1993. Continuing on then with the total. Sugar beet, we only had 1.2 million acres, but it was $80 an acre, so that chips in $96 million. Canola, we don't raise a lot of canola in the United States. The bulk of it, of course, is raised in your part of the country. That was only $7.50 an acre, and the bulk of the canola is raised in Canada, I never did the numbers on that. I stayed in the United States. So if we subtotal all this for corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, and left out alfalfa, as that was deregulated again in 2010, we total up to just under $8.7 billion worth of tech fee in 1 year for the United States alone. That does not include seed, fertilizer, chemical, or any other inputs that the farmer is going to purchase to raise a crop. Do you see a possible motivation? We have been told by proponents of GM technology that this is just an accelerated process of hybrid development that we've been doing for thousands of years. It really upsets me when I hear that come from someone at one of our land-grant universities who absolutely knows better. Now, it's true, we have been improving our genetics for thousands of years. But the techniques that are used from genetic engineering haven't been used for thousands of years, and I'll show you why and how. It's absolutely untrue when they say this. How's it work? A foreign gene is shot or inserted into the DNA of that plant. They have absolutely no control as to where it will end up. When they do this insertion to this point in time with the technologies that have been implemented for the crops that we have in production, they may use a virus, such as the cauliflower mosaic virus. They have to have a mechanism to get full infection of every cell of all of the DNA to get this expression they want. The example would be, I want a herbicide-tolerant crop. If I don't get full infection throughout that whole plant, I could have that herbicide tolerance in the top part of the plant, but not the bottom. So I spray the herbicide, and the top part lives, and the bottom part dies. We're in trouble. In addition to that virus, they will purposely develop a bacterium that is resistant to antibiotics. They have a genetically engineered antibiotic resistant bacteria that they insert that's used as a marker to dictate where have we put this in the plant. They will also use an agrobacterium. An agrobacterium is basically a cancer cell of the soil. This is also used as an infection mechanism, and they have also used E. coli, components from E. coli, to infect and get this establishment of this characteristic in the plant. The European Food Safety Authority analyzed 85 different genetically engineered crops for the presence of a foreign virus. They documented that 54 of these 85 crops that they analyzed had the presence of an unspecified and undenoted. They're supposed to tell you what they're putting in there when they do this. 54 of the 85 had a foreign virus entity present in the crop. I had the good fortune of having a molecular biologist attend the meeting I did in Pasco last week. She had just retired, and she had done thousands upon thousands of these genetic insertions. I had said in my presentation that the chance of getting this in the same place twice was 1 in 100,000. And she said to me, Howard, I would like to add to that. I would like to correct you. I said, I'm all ears. She sent me this slide, and she sent me the math on the next page that she uses to illustrate the accuracy of the insertion of the foreign gene that is conducted in every genetically engineered crop. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. I'm just going to go straight to the bottom.
Previous picture, just from below.
Okay. She has what she uses it, illustrates it as a grumpy gene. Well, the reason that would be very applicable is the presence of all the infection mechanisms that they have. There's from 1,000 to 10,000 DNA fragments per cell. You got to get all this covered. So when you do the math, and she did it, and I won't bore you with it, but she actually gave me a more updated figure after she sent this, because she sent me another email and she says, I got to thinking about this. I didn't go high enough. But I stayed with the trillion because everybody's familiar with that. That's what our deficit is, so we know that number real well. 1 in a trillion or 1 in 100 trillion is the percentage chance that you're going to get that placed in the same spot. And you're going to see pretty quick why that's important. Every time there's a new genetically engineered crop developed, there's the possibility and the presence of a new, novel, or foreign protein as a result. What's the effect of this? Well, first of all, let's think a little bit, what is the goal of raising crops? To provide a food source for mammals. So, how many mammals are there? There are 5,399 other subjects in this experiment with you and I. We're the two-legged version. Side effects. As I mentioned, in 1992, I had the good fortune of starting to work with farmers all across the country. Customers in crop and livestock production in 12 states. A customer in Nebraska was convinced by his seed salesman to plant his first BT corn. He planted enough to where he could fill one grain bin so he could keep it separate. He went to grind feed for his sows, and the ration was for the conception ration. He was going to turn the boar in and have them bred. He was used to a 95 to 98% conception rate on his sows. That ration, his conception rate dropped to 65%. He had a 30% reduction in his conception rate. He called the vet came out, they did blood tests on the sows, they checked the feed for mold and mycotoxin, they couldn't figure anything out. He called me and he said, what do you think? I said, don't feed the BT, we've heard some issues. So he took it out of the ration. He went back to the conventional corn, his conception rate went back to 95 to 98%. He went along fine and he thought, I really need to pull some corn out of that bin again. That probably won't happen again, so he ground from that BT bin again. The second time his conception rate dropped 70%. That was the last time he ever used BT corn in his sow ration. In South Dakota, we had a different operation with a different BT corn. They had explicit records. Everything was computerized. They knew every pound of this and that went everywhere. They knew their production records. If they didn't have such a tight production control on everything, they might have missed what happened to them. When they fed BT, their litter averages was down 1.6 pigs per litter. The weight of the piglets when they were born was also lighter. We go to west central Iowa, a different BT corn. This gentleman planted the bulk of his whole farm to it because the seed salesman said it's the thing that you want and need. The only thing he had was his buffer corn, which was very diluted in the mixture of all this BT. He had something known as pseudo-pregnancies. The sows appeared to conceive, they would go full term, and upon delivery, all they delivered was a sack of water in the afterbirth. The veterinary started working on this problem. They got the university involved. They couldn't figure out what was wrong. They did blood work, they tested the feed, they checked for everything under the sun. He was a Farm Bureau member. The Farm Bureau spokesman came out and did a story on his problem with his livestock. When that article came out in the Farm Bureau spokesman, he starts getting phone calls from farmers in the surrounding counties. They were all having the same problem at varying degrees. As those farmers put their heads together, they realized they were all feeding the exact same BT corn to their sows when they had the problem. The university wasn't able to find any possible connection between that Bt corn and the problem, but when all the farmers quit using that Bt corn, the problem went away. In our part of Iowa, when the genetically engineered feedstuffs went into the ration, we saw ileitis, salmonella, and bloody bowel in the pigs. As we were able to control this with antibiotics or other measures, every so often you'd lose a pig. Every time we did a post-mortem on that pig, we would find ulcers in the stomach of the pig. We also saw consistent immune system disorders in these pigs. This foreign protein that is the result of every genetically engineered crop can have a devastating effect in the digestive system or a subtle effect depending on the host mammal. We have seen it consistently cause severe inflammation. The immune system. Now, your immune system is your defense mechanism. Your immune system is supposed to protect you. 70 to 80% of the cells of your immune system are in your digestive tract. Now I want you to imagine that I am your immune system. I am in your digestive system. I realize it's a little hard to stomach, but bear with me. I've got to throw a pun in there once in a while. You have consumed something that I have identified as a foreign protein, and it just happens to be this post. It is my job to protect you 24/7, 365. Now I want you to imagine you leave here, and you come back at 10 minutes to 4 tomorrow. What is going to happen to my strength in that time period? Are we seeing an increase in autoimmune diseases in our country? 80+% of the food supply contains ingredients from genetically engineered crops containing foreign proteins. Do you know anyone with an issue related to the immune system? That brings me to a point in time that I'm going to show you some pictures of hog stomachs. The pictures are a little graphic, but no one has ever passed out. These ladies thought they had to come back for more from last night. Thank you for coming. On this journey that I started in 1989, we developed a natural meat program. And we got to a point in time that, okay, we needed volume customs processing of these animals. So 8 miles up the road from my place, there's a processing plant known as Supreme Pack. And they do custom processing for a whole bunch of different niche pork companies, many of which they were drug-free. But in their drug-free program, they had no restrictions on feeding genetically engineered feed. At the time I took these pictures, 75 to 80% of the corn in our area was genetically engineered, and 85 to 90% of the soy was genetically engineered, so it was safe to presume that they were eating genetically engineered. We went to the plant to take the tour. Dr. McGuire was the veterinary that gave us the tour of the plant. And while we were waiting for him to come to the conference room, I was talking to the plant manager, and he says, well, what's different about your natural pork compared to everybody else's? And I said, well, we don't use antibiotics, we don't use hormones, we don't use animal byproducts, which was the same as everybody else's, and we do special things to the soil and prove there's no chemical residue in the soil and no chemical residue in the crop. And we absolutely would not have anything to do with genetically engineered crops. As I made that statement, Dr. McGuire walked in, and then I went on to explain the potential development of the irritation, inflammation, or ulcerations as a result of these foreign proteins. And Dr. McGuire got a real funny look on his face. And, you know, I have that effect on people, so I just kind of sloughed it off. He took us through that plant, and he showed us everything they do with every single part of the hog. At one point in time, we go through this door, he turns and he washes his hands in the sink and he sprays disinfectant on his hand, and he picks a hog stomach out of the container that they were in and holds it up so that I could see the fundus end. Well, I worked for a veterinary for 8 years when I got out of high school, so I was familiar with what the inside of an animal looked like. Right away, I saw the irritation and inflammation even though that stomach wasn't opened up. So they allowed me to come back and take pictures of hog stomachs. I took 10 pictures of hog stomachs from our program that was multi-generational, no GMOs, and drug-free. I took 10 pictures of what I'll call A natural, which was a drug-free program but no restrictions on GMOs. 10 pictures of a B natural, which was drug-free, no restrictions on GMOs. And 10 pictures of hog stomachs from pigs that were fed antibiotics the majority of their lifetime. I have put 2 of each in here for the sake of brevity. Dr. Newman is the veterinary I worked for 8 years. He was semi-retired at this point in time, and he was the only person of the vets that I showed these pictures to that knew what a healthy hog stomach looked like, because the other vets that I showed these pictures to that had the redness had been seeing it for the previous 10 years. So if you see something all the time, what do you call it? This is the first one of the healthy hog stomach. Notice the overall skin tone color of that stomach. This yellow over here is normal. That will be present at varying degrees in some or more of the pictures. That is there as a result of the enzymes and the amino acids still being produced, but there's no feed there to digest. This is the second one of the 10 on our program. There's a little bit of irritation right in this area right here. You can see some slight pink. This is one that is very representative of all the A natural. You can see the overall pronounced irritation, inflammation, and there is a pinpoint ulcer right there. This is the worst one of the A natural. The irritation, inflammation is pronounced confined to this area, and there are there's pinpoint ulcers here, here, and here, and about a 3 to 4 centimeter ulcer there. This is one that is representative of the B natural. This is the worst one of the B natural. As you can see, the overall inflammation is worse. Pinpoint ulcer, 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 ulcer. Another series, here's some, there's some down here, and there's about a 5 to 6 centimeter ulcer. This is one that is pretty representative of the antibiotic-fed hogs. You notice how it has a pale appearance compared to the others. Dr. McGuire was quick to point out to me the benefit of the antibiotic. It will reduce the irritation and inflammation, but there is an ulcer dead center. It still didn't stop the full potential effect of that foreign protein. This is the worst one of the drug-free animal, or the antibiotic-fed animals that we took a picture of. I called all of this information that I've shared with you up to this point in time coincidental and circumstantial. I was working with Dr. Ingham that time on many soil projects, and I told her about this, and she said, "Howard, that's anecdotal from a scientific viewpoint. Now take it to the next level and set up the protocols and do the scientific study." So we did. The good Lord saw fit for me to connect with a scientist from Australia, Dr. Judy Carman. She is the lead scientist on the scientific study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal in June of this year, the Journal of Organic Systems. We took 84 pigs right off their mother when they were weaned, and they went on non-GM corn and soy. We took an equal number of male and female, same size pigs, 84, and put them on GMO corn and soy, and they were fed on those rations until the day they were harvested as a meat animal. When they were harvested, we collected all of their organs and all of the entrails in the animal, and we took it off site and we had 2 licensed, practicing, very experienced veterinaries doing autopsy on everything. We weighed all the organs of all the animals. We collected all this data, and Dr. Carmen put it into the scientific statistical form. I hate them numbers, so I don't even try to remember that form that she said. This is an example of what we saw of one of the non-GM fed stomachs. As you see, its overall appearance is the skin tone color. I will tell you that the pigs that we used were from a herd that were on GM feed because we couldn't find the volume we needed in a non-GM environment. These pigs also had PRRS. It's PRRS, all in capital letters. That stands for Porcine Respiratory Reproductive Syndrome. The veterinaries that are familiar with PRRS and know a thing or two about human health, and by the way, our digestive systems are just about identical to that of a pig. PRRS is almost identical to AIDS. I know a gentleman, and the PRRS condition is prevalent throughout the pork industry in the United States. I know a gentleman in southwest Minnesota that has not fed GMOs since 2003. He is the only person in his neighborhood with a farrow to finish hog operation that has never had to repopulate his herd 1, 2, or 3 times because of PRRS. They tell everyone PRRS is an airborne disease and you have to have a $50,000 ventilation system on your buildings to protect your animals. You could throw a cat through the side of some of his buildings and that's how airtight they are. He's never had PRRS. What happens when you challenge an immune system? Kind of like going up against a pole, isn't it? Another one of the non-GM fed, there is some irritation, inflammation, which there was some in the non-GM fed. We used no antibiotics in this study. We had a 13% death loss. The industry claimed that we were terrible caretakers and we had bad husbandry because we had a 13% death loss. Well, we didn't say we had an antibiotic-free program, but the study explained everything we put in the feed, and there was no antibiotics listed there, so it was written down, but they just didn't catch it. The typical death loss for PRRS would be 25 to 30% in a non-antibiotic environment. We only had 13%. This is an example of the severe inflammation that was expressed in a high statistical number of the genetically engineered feared animals. You see the red, there's also ulcer here, and ulcer here. We did not have a high incidence of ulcers, but we had a high incidence of that severe inflammation. The statistical findings. The genetically engineered fed animals were 2.6 times or 260% more likely to have severe inflammation in their stomach. Of that, the males were 400% more likely and the females were 220% more likely. The other significant statistical finding, the weight of the utera of the female GM-fed pigs was 25% heavier than the normal weight of the non-GM-fed pigs' utera. We did not anticipate finding that. If we would have been prepared and saved all the utera for further histological research. But remember, I talked about conception issues and digestive issues that led us to doing this study. I've asked Dr. Carmen, she's an epidemiologist, I says, what could this uterine weight differentiation mean? She says, well, the first thing you think of is inflammation and swelling. And then she went on to quote how many different names of how many different conditions that the name is that long that I don't try to remember. The thing that was the most interesting to me, not being a scientist, was the anecdotal information that we observed and were prepared for. We had to weigh these pigs every week. Dr. Pustai wouldn't let me get by without that. He helped us with our protocol. He said, you have to do that, Howard. I says, you realize how much work that is? He said, that don't matter, you have to do it. When they were small, we weighed them in a container on the scale, and when they were bigger, we chased them to the scale. We had a little corral set up, and they'd go through there, and it was like a simple maze. The GM-fed pigs could not manipulate this maze without confusion. They did it every week. Pigs are creatures of habit. In addition to being confused, they were irritable. They were biting and fighting and picking on one another. There was also an overall listlessness in the GM-fed animals. They were never content. Anecdotal, scientific, where's common sense? I look at these two facts and look at what's happening to the children in our country right now. And I say, where's the connection? Is anybody looking for the connection? We also saw skin issues, an eczema type or skin erysipelas type issue on GM-fed animal. Thankfully, that pig got over that without treatment. Well, he did have treatment. That was in the nursery. When we moved them to the grow finish stage, they were outside. Guess what? The vitamin D solved that problem for him. Now we're shifting gears to beef. A friend of mine in Ohio processes all his own animals on the farm. He also processes for his neighbors. He only feeds non-GMO. His neighbors feed GMO. Well, he's very observant, and he pays close attention to a lot of things. As you see, the fat covering on this carcass is mostly white, and the fat covering on that carcass is dark yellow. The covering on the body cavity of the organs is mostly white, and the covering on the body cavity of the organs there is dark yellow. We're told if we consume a toxin, it will accumulate in the body fat. Which one of these do you think had a better diet as far as toxins were concerned, and which one would you rather eat?
I'm vegetarian.
Here's a graph that looks at inflammatory bowel disease admittances to hospital and discharges from 92 through 2004. It also looks at the implementation of genetically engineered soy and corn. You can see a correlation in the increase in both incidences. I will show you more information like this later in the presentation. Glyphosate is the active chemical ingredient in Roundup herbicide and numerous other generic forms of that herbicide. Roundup itself was patented, as I said, in 1974. At that time, it was utilized for only one use, as a burn down. They would apply that Roundup to the field and kill all the weeds and grass that were present before they planted the crop. They had a clean start. No-till farming has been a definite benefit in a lot of people's operations and has benefited the soil. The other use, then, of the increased application of glyphosate comes with the genetically engineered crops that are tolerated to withstand it. You spray the glyphosate on the crop doesn't die, it absorbs a certain percentage of that chemical and retains it. The third use, and probably the most significant increasing use of glyphosate herbicides today, it's used as a desiccant or a ripening agent on crops that are not genetically engineered. It is used on oats, wheat, rye, barley, edible peas, flax, forage sorghum. Some countries are using it on corn pre-harvest. In the instance of small grain, they may have mechanically swathed that grain when it was close to maturity, laid it in a windrow, and then came along and harvested it a week later. Now they go out and they spray it with a glyphosate herbicide 7 to 10 days ahead of when they want to harvest it. It dries down and they come and they machine harvest it. What do you think happens to the glyphosate residue that they spray on the crop? This is a schematic provided by Dr. Bob Kramer, a USDA Ag Research Scientist at the University of Missouri. Dr. Kramer has done excellent work in looking at the effect of glyphosate on the plants and the soil. Glyphosate, first of all, Roundup, active ingredient again, works from foliar application. You spray it on the weed. It's systemic. It translocates to every part of that weed in a very short period of time. That's why it's been so effective as a herbicide. A minimum of 20% of the glyphosate that hits the foliage goes through that plant, out into the soil through the root. That area right around the root is known as the rhizosphere. That's an area that's rich with microbial diversity. Many beneficial organisms will be present in the rhizosphere. It has been scientifically documented that glyphosate either severely diminishes or wipes out several families of beneficial soil microorganisms. In many cases, these beneficials are the control mechanism for the opportunistic or bad soil microorganisms that cause a host of plant diseases. The manufacturer of the first glyphosate-based herbicide denied this for many years. They can no longer deny it because in 2010 they were granted a patent by the U.S. Patent Office on glyphosate. You can go on the Patent Office website and look this up. It's patent number 7771736. And you will see that Monsanto was granted a patent on glyphosate as an antibiotic. As you start to read this, you will see it's registered for parasite control. But if you read down all the way through it, you will see at 1/10 of a part per million, glyphosate will wipe out the vast majority of beneficial organisms that we need to have in our digestive system. When they registered Roundup as a herbicide, they said it's not going to hurt humans because humans don't have a shikimate pathway, which is true. Plants do, but guess what? The microorganisms in our digestive tract have a shikimate pathway. And I will show you further information of how much damage they're doing in that regard. Glyphosate is also a very broad spectrum strong chelator. Chelate is a Greek word meaning claw or to hold. I have chelated this. I cannot pull it out. It is tied up. Glyphosate chelates calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, copper, nickel, cobalt, boron, selenium, molybdenum, and potassium. When it chelates it, it don't let go. It will chelate those nutrients in the soil. It will chelate those nutrients in the plant. It will chelate those nutrients when it's present in the grain. It will chelate those nutrients when it's in the plant residue. Glyphosate attaches quickly to clay particles in the soil. They've tried to portray it as environmentally friendly because it does this. Well, the only thing that protects it from doing is leaching into the water supply, but the half-life of glyphosate, and that's the time that half of it shall be degraded and broken down and no longer a toxic compound, is from 14 days to 22.5 years, depending on the soil conditions that you have present. This is all scientifically documented. There's no hearsay to any of it. I have told you that glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide in the world. Glyphosate doesn't kill weeds. Now you're thinking that's got to be the ultimate oxymoron statement anybody's ever made. It's the most widely used herbicide in the world, but it don't kill weeds. It has been scientifically documented 4 times that you cannot kill a weed or a plant with glyphosate if it's growing in sterile soil. These 3 pots had edible beans planted in them. This is the control. There was nothing sprayed on that one. This one is raised in field soil. It has a full complement of good and bad organisms, present. This one's raised in sterile soil. They put that soil in an autoclave and they killed everything in it. There's no good or bad bugs present. I didn't think you could even raise something in that type of soil, but you can if you have enough nutrition. You see how this one is stunted compared to that one? The way that glyphosate works, it stops the movement of the natural growth hormones within that plant. This will happen for about 2 weeks. That's the first step it takes to the demise of the weed. So it's like you put a brick on his head. He can't go nowhere. The next thing it does is stops the flow of the enzymes and the amino acids within that plant that are designed to run the plant's defense mechanism. Plants don't have immune systems, they have defense mechanisms. So you shut down that plant's ability to defend itself against disease. Remember I said the good organisms in the root zone are killed and the bad ones thrive? Well, you need a soil-borne fungal pathogen to cause a disease to kill anything that's been sprayed with glyphosate. Over here, this first picture is a corn plant that they purposely injected with anthracnose. Anthracnose is a disease that causes stalk rot. The natural defense mechanisms of that plant kicked into gear and stopped the spread of that stalk rot. You can see the insertion site, but it's walled it off, and that plant is viable. They split the stalk in half so we could see this. On these, they also inserted the anthracnose, but they sprayed it with glyphosate. That immediately shuts down all the enzymatic and the amino acid flow for that plant to defend itself. This was further demonstrated by another research product in Purdue. They put a fungicide, which is designed to stop these fungal diseases that are caused by the pathogenic organisms from the soil. They put that on with the glyphosate and they wiped out all of the effect of that glyphosate to kill a weed. This is a culmination of scientific studies that documents some of the diseases that are absolutely increasing everywhere you use a glyphosate herbicide. There are over 40 plant diseases that have been scientifically documented to increase in a glyphosate environment. It has on here listed from apples to wheat. In wheat, some of these, depending on the environmental conditions and a few other factors, some of these diseases you only need to use glyphosate 1 year out of 3 years prior to planting to the wheat, and you'll see 150 to 300% increase in some of the diseases in the wheat. This is a picture of cornfields in Iowa in 2010. We had somewhat of an ideal year for disease expression in the corn. We had adequate moisture, we had adequate heat. Well, what do you see is the color of the majority of the corn in that picture? What color? Brown. If you're driving across Iowa in August and you see the majority of the corn is brown, what do you call it? Everybody says that. If the bulk of the corn is brown, what else might we call it? Normal. But when there's a green cornfield, that now is abnormal in that picture because it's not the majority, and yet that's what we see. That's what corn is supposed to look like in August in Iowa, regardless of the weather. They cannot put the plant protection products on fast enough to control all the fungal diseases that have gone poof as a result of the continual glyphosate use. This is a picture of a soybean field. Here's a white pole. You draw an imaginary straight line. You see all the brown plants there. You see the green here. The previous year, from here that way, was alfalfa. From here this way was sweet corn. They sprayed that alfalfa in the fall with 2 quarts of glyphosate herbicide to kill it. So that they could plant these glyphosate-tolerant beans, they sprayed them one time this growing season with glyphosate. And now we have a full-blown expression of sudden death syndrome. That's what caused these beans to die as a result of that residual glyphosate kicking those soil organisms into overdrive in that portion of the field. To date, there are quote-unquote 24 weeds resistant to glyphosate worldwide. This is an example of the amaranth pigweed. It's a picture that a customer that I was working with in southwest Georgia in 2010 sent to me. You might say he has a little bit of weed pressure in this field. There is a few corn plants in there, and the reason the corn is so scant, there was terrible germination on the seed that was planted in there, so that's why he let it go. That's about knee-high, the amaranth pigweed in that picture. That weed used to be this tall when it was full grown, and it would have 100,000 seeds on it, 3 foot tall. They left a portion of that field that they didn't tear up for purposes of demonstrating to the seed company what happened. This gentleman is 6'4" and weighs 280 pounds, and he has pigweed behind him that are 10 to 12 feet tall. And they have over 400,000 seeds per plant. We go to Iowa. These shorter plants are soybeans. You see the weeds sticking up above that. That's known as tall water hemp. This field was sprayed 3 times with a glyphosate herbicide. He wouldn't tell me how strong a rate he used the second and the third time, and the third time he also put full rate of another herbicide with it, and he still couldn't kill those weeds. There's another view. When it has to compete with corn, it'll grow up. You see it on the edge of that cornfield. It's over 8 feet tall. This is a scientific study that was conducted at the University of Missouri with Dr. Kramer and one of his PhD students. They took a conventional soybean in the glyphosate-resistant version, and they sprayed the glyphosate on the resistant one and not the other, of course. They grew them side by side in the greenhouse, and they measured all of these statistics. They looked at what happened to the lignin content. The lignin is the woody component in the plant that helps it stand up. As you see, it went down at both a sequential half rate and full rate. Then they measured the amino acid production. You remember I said the defense mechanism of the plant? It also declined significantly. They measured the photosynthesis capacity of that plant. It also declined significantly. And they measured the water use efficiency. It took more than twice as much water to raise the same amount of plant biomass when you had the trait inserted and you applied the glyphosate herbicide. You remember they said they were going to develop that drought tolerance thing? What happens when the lignin content is down in the plant? This is a picture of a cornfield in Iowa one day after a rainstorm and a 50-mile-an-hour wind the night before. This is conventional corn that stood straight, and this is glyphosate-tolerant corn standing right beside it. This is not uncommon. They actually have developed a nickname for some of these hybrids that do this. They call it Eileen. Glyphosate residues. Dr. Paul Capel and his team of U.S. Geological Survey scientists set up monitoring equipment to detect the amount of glyphosate in the air, the rain, and the rivers in 2010 and 2011, and they published this study. They found significant levels of glyphosate in the air, in the rain, and in the rivers in Iowa and Mississippi. It's the only two places they looked for it. We have found glyphosate residue in alfalfa, barley, corn, edible peas, potatoes, soybeans, and I could go on. In the alfalfa, it was not genetically engineered alfalfa. The glyphosate residue came from the poultry litter. The poultry was eating glyphosate-produced corn and soy. The glyphosate residue passes through the chicken. It's in the manure. They've used the manure as fertilizer on the alfalfa. The alfalfa grew. They harvested the hay. They fed the hay to the animals, and the animals got sick. So they went back and they traced it back. In poultry litter that's fed glyphosate-produced corn and soy, it is typical to see 2/3 of a quart of glyphosate herbicide present in every 3 ton of manure. With the testing that we have done on our own, that is pretty standard procedure. In 1994, the EPA told us 2 parts per million per day per life of glyphosate wasn't going to hurt anyone. The EPA raised this up. As of the 1st of May this year, they raised the tolerance levels of every single thing that they have a glyphosate residue tolerance level for. On grain, the winner is canola. 40 parts per million is what they allow. In forages, it's 400 parts per million. In soy, it was 1/10 of a part per million in 97. They jumped it to 20. We routinely see 17 parts per million in various soy products. Seralini, the French scientist, has done lots of excellent studies on the toxicity of glyphosate. At 1/2 a part per million, glyphosate will destroy both the sperm and the egg, causing infertility. At 2/10 of a part per million, endocrine disruption can begin. Endocrine disruption in the cell for a fetus leads to potential birth defects. For an adult, leads to potential tumors because the cellular reformulation and generation that constantly happens in our body is messed up by the endocrine disruptors. Dr. Andreas Carrasco is a scientist in Argentina. He was consistently witnessing birth defects in the babies that were born to the mothers who lived in the rural communities immediately adjacent to the glyphosate-tolerant soybean fields that were being sprayed with an airplane with glyphosate herbicide. He set up a study with frog and chick embryos and purposely injected them with varying levels of glyphosate to see if he could determine the cause. He documented that it only took 2.03 parts per million of glyphosate residue to cause birth defects. They have seen a 447% increase in the birth defects to these babies born to the mothers between 1998 and 2008, affecting the heart, the purpura, musculoskeletal, and thyroid. They also saw cranial. They've seen cleft palates. They've seen malformed cheekbones. They've seen flat spots on the top of the head. Are you familiar with the increase of birth defects that are happening in your state? I would suggest you go to the Pharm Wars, Pharm Wars website and do a little reading.
What is that again?
Pharm Wars and or Info Pharm Wars. Go to that website and investigate this.
Wars, W-A-R-S.
Pharm Wars.
He's from Iowa.
Yeah, I got an accent. You know, I spent a lot of time in the South. It took me 3 trips down there to figure out where the harrow was. See, I thought a harrow was a drag, but it's not. We call that a disc in Iowa, but it's a harrow down there. Glyphosate. Strong chelating capabilities. The calcium affecting teeth and bones. Iron affecting the blood. Manganese and zinc affecting the liver and the kidney. Copper and magnesium chelation affecting the brain. Dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. This is a picture of a stillborn baby calf. Dr. Art Dunham is a a veterinarian in Northeast Iowa. In 2003, he started investigating and documenting an ever-alarmingly increasing rate of manganese deficiency in his farming customers' livestock. This is a part of the country where they have always had high to excessive manganese levels in the soil. They never added manganese to a ration because if they did, they could have manganese toxicity. Because of all the increased glyphosate use in crop production and the residuals in the soil, that manganese tied up, now the manganese deficiencies are expressing themselves in the livestock. It is not always documentable to have the manganese deficiency in the grain or the forage because the manganese may be there, but when the glyphosate residue is present with it, it prevents it from being available. What about correlation in health for humans in this subject? Dr. Nancy Swanson is a PhD physicist from your state. I had the pleasure of meeting her in person last week. Been communicating with her by email and telephone for probably 3-4 months now. She, in January of this year, published articles where she investigated the use of genetically engineered crops and glyphosate herbicide and looked to see if there was a correlation between that and various diseases in our country. We're at 1996 here, and here's the introduction of genetically engineered corn, cotton, and soy, and the percentage that's being used in our country in 2012. It's in the low 90s and high 80s. Then she looked at a correlation between the glyphosate use and specific diseases. Starting in 1990, autism was pretty flat. 96, the introduction of genetically engineered crops. The yellow line is the increase in autism, the yellow bar, and the red line is the increase in glyphosate applied. The Pearson correlation coefficient factor is 98.5%. Now that doesn't prove cause and effect. But Dr. Stephanie Seneff from MIT has had particular interest in autism for a long time. 1 in 150 children in our country in 2007, 1 in 100 by 2009, 1 in 50 by 2013. At our current trend increase, we'll be at 1 in 2 before we know it. Back to Dr. Swanson's information. Thank you. Diabetes and glyphosate. If the trend would have continued from 1980, the green line would come across like this. The persons with diabetes is the yellow bar. The genetically engineered corn and soy is the red. The glyphosate applied is the blue. Again, a 98% efficiency factor in that correlation of both implementation and effect. Obesity in our country. What happens if you have a broad-spectrum chelator that ties up the mineral content in the soil and ties up the mineral content in the plant and ties up the mineral content in the grain, causing the production of a hollow-caloried food source that will be high in carbohydrates? Will a person have to consume more to be satisfied because of deficient energy levels in the grain? The percentage of people that have been classified as obese, the genetically engineered soy is purple, the glyphosate, again, a 98% plus coefficient factor. Thyroid cancer. The trend, if we stayed on the same trend we started in 1975, we'd be at 30%. The incidence today, 2009 actually, it's up over 85%. The trend on the genetically engineered crops and the glyphosate use, again, a coefficient factor of 98%. I talked to Dr. Huber for quite a while yesterday. He had just returned from Hawaii. He was out there to testify at a council hearing on one of the islands. He said if they have one or two examples of this, they can blow it off. But when it keeps coming with that 98%, they only need a 5% correlation to start an investigation. Seralini is a French scientist who conducted the first ever lifetime feeding study of genetic engineered crops fed to lab animals. He also had glyphosate residue in the diet of some of these animals. Now, he was viciously attacked verbally by everybody that's a proponent of genetic engineering. Even some of the regulatory agencies said this was bad science. He did not anticipate this to be a cancer study. If he would have anticipated that, he would have had 40 or 50 rats in each group. The fact that the rats developed all the tumors they did was not his plan. But it showed up. But he got ridiculed as a result of it. He had 20 rats in each treatment. Now, he's been vindicated in a major way because the French government has ordered a repeat of this study, and they're going to raise the numbers of the animals up to the level to where it meets all the studies, toxicology and cancer. But he fed these rats for their lifetime, which is basically 24 months. The longest so-called safety study of the industry to prove genetically engineered crops are safe has been 3 months or 90 days. In his study, the tumors that developed showed up at 4 to 7 months on the rats that developed them the fastest. That was the ones that were eating the genetically engineered food. Only 11% of the diet was genetically engineered food, by the way, and the ones that were consuming the glyphosate. All of these rats developed tumors before their life ended. The industry attacked him because he used the wrong rat. It was the Sprague Dawley rat. It is the perfect rat to use in this type of study for tumor development, although he wasn't looking for it, because they develop tumors at the same rate that we do. At 23 months, the control rats were starting to develop tumors. The biggest hypocrisy of the criticism is the fact that the industry used the Sprague Dawley rat in their 90-day study to prove the safety of genetically engineered crops. As I said, it will be repeated. Here's a picture of some of the mammary tumors that those rats saw. We're going to jump over the pond and go to Germany for a little bit. Dr. Monica Kruger is an excellent veterinary pathologist at the Leipzig University. She has done lots of good research pinpointing problems directly connected to glyphosate in the feed supply and the damage in the digestive tract. Germany has a cool, overcast climate, so they have a persistent problem with Clostridium botulinum in the soil. So that's always been an underlying factor. But as they say, the straw that breaks the camel's back, she has documented that 1/10 of a part per million of glyphosate residue, which was documented in the soybean meal that they imported from the U.S., killed 3 beneficial organisms in the rumen of the cow. Those 3 organisms are the controls for the Clostridium botulinum. When you wipe out the controls, the botulism goes through the roof. The babies that succumb to SIDS in Germany, they're doing autopsies on them. An MD told us the vast majority of the babies in that scenario that succumb to SIDS test positive for the botulism, for the Clostridium botulinum organism. They do not have genetically engineered crops in Germany. They use glyphosate as a burn down prior to planting, and they use glyphosate as a pre-harvest desiccant. They did a random sampling of professional people in Germany for glyphosate residue. They had volunteers from all, that none of them had anything to do with production agriculture or handling glyphosate in any way, shape, or form. They had them come in and give a urine sample. 100% of them were urinating out higher levels of glyphosate than is allowed to be in the drinking water supply. Dr. Kruger also documented 1/10 of a part per million of glyphosate residue in the feedstuff for chickens wipes out 3 beneficial organisms that are the control mechanism for E. coli, and the E. coli goes through the roof. Dr. Huber, a retired emeritus professor from Purdue University, wrote a letter to Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack in January of 2010. It was to draw the Secretary's attention to a problem that we were seeing in livestock. It was the identification of a new to science suspect organism that is causing spontaneous abortions in livestock. Beef and dairy cattle, hogs, sheep, chickens, goats, pigs, and horses, where genetically engineered feedstuffs that have been sprayed with glyphosate are fed to the animals. Some of the higher incidents of these spontaneous abortions are as much as 30 to 50% in the female animals that are supposed to be helping the farmers make a living. As a result of that letter and some political pressure by Dave Murphy, he was able to arrange a meeting with USDA, which we attended in July of 2011. On the left is Bob Streit from Central Iowa, an excellent crop scout. Next to him is Dr. McNeil, PhD researcher, crop researcher, worked in the military with Dr. Huber for a time at Fort Detrick, and excellent researcher. Myself, Dr. Huber, and of course Dave Murphy. We had an hour and a half with USDA. We knew going into this meeting they were going to say, where's your independent, peer-reviewed, published research to document the validity of this organism you claim to be causing these problems? In the letter, Dr. Huber appealed for assistance to help us get to the bottom of this problem because we didn't have the financial means or the equipment to get to the bottom of this. This whole problem has been researched by one individual who shall remain completely anonymous. First, Dr. McNeil spoke. He explained to the people at USDA that the farming customers that he advises, 165,000 acres in conventional farming, 6,000 acres in organic, his conventional farming customers that were the early adapters of glyphosate technology and stuck with it and subsequently had to use more and more and more and more each year, saw their corn yields in 2010 at 75 to 100 bushels per acre when their neighbors were getting 220. It was due to the buildup of the glyphosate in the soil and the subsequent nutrition and biological damage that it caused in the poor performance and yield. Instead of 70 bushel soybeans, they were getting 20 to 30. Then Bob Streit showed pictures and documentation from the airplanes and all of the disease in all of the fields that has become commonplace, and then every once in a while there's a green field that's non-GMO. Then it was my turn. I asked a question. I said, please show me the long-term, independent, peer-reviewed, published studies you have on file to document the safety of any of the genetically engineered crops your agency has approved. That received no response from all 3 of the USDA department heads that were present, nor their one assistant. I then went on to quote scientific studies. I quoted the Aziz study out of Canada that documented that the Cry1AB Bt toxin, which the industry told us is supposed to break down in the digestive tract, was found to be present in 93% of the pregnant women's blood that they tested, and 80% of these women passed this toxin on to their babies. Then I quoted the Gallagher study, which was commissioned by the Supreme Court in India. Dr. Gallagher was supposed to look at the safety of Bt brinjal, what they were wanting to introduce into India. The first thing that Dr. Gallagher did was document the fact that the OECD sound guidelines of sound science research and safety testing have never been applied to safety testing on genetically engineered crops, and that the 14, 21, 30, or 90-day studies have all showed varying levels of concern in blood work and other issues from the research, and yet the crops have been approved in spite of it. Then I quoted the Seralini study on infertility and glyphosate and the Carrasco study, and I sat down. Dr. Huber had the bulk of the time for the rest of the meeting. The meeting ran 15-20 minutes long. The head person from USDA said, I have to go, I have another meeting, I'm late. I was positioned around the table in a fashion that I politely backed away from the table, stood up between the door and that head person, and I repeated my question. Would you please show me the long-term, independent, peer-reviewed studies you have on file to document the safety of any of the genetically engineered crops your agency has approved? The response was, that's not my job, and that was a true statement on that person's part. I politely stepped out of the way. That person left. The person whose job it was in the meeting, and that person came up to me and said, I would like to address your question. We have an EIS for every genetically engineered crop that's been approved.
What is EIS?
I'm going to explain that. For your benefit, an EIS means Environmental Impact Study. Today, if I were a company developing a genetically engineered crop, I would do my own environmental impact study. I would bring the paperwork to you at USDA. They would take that paperwork, and then they'll say to the public, now you have 30, 60, 90, 120 days, whatever the case may be, to enter comments on this. We have an EIS. Oh, I forgot the last part. After they take the comments, they ignore all of them and they approve that plan. We have an EIS for every genetically engineered crop that's been approved. I said, yes, sir, I'm familiar with that process. I says, I participate in it regularly. I said, I testified at the field hearing you had in Lincoln, Nebraska on Roundup Ready alfalfa and Roundup Ready sugar beets. I said, I was the only person that testified against the deregulation. I was the only person that had peer-reviewed, published scientific studies to back up my testimony that documented the harm of glyphosate to the sugar beet and to the environment and the organisms in the soil. I submitted additional comments through your online process. I said, sir, the fact of the matter is science has absolutely no place in your approval process. I know that's not your fault because that dates back to when the first Bush was in the White House, and we had a man at the head of the FDA by the name of Michael Taylor. Mr. Taylor oversaw 2 terms being established relative to genetically engineered crops, substantially equivalent and generally recognized as safe. There was zero science behind either one of those terms being established, and Mr. Taylor is today the food czar in the current administration and has held a number of regulatory agency positions between now and then, but his most notorious career accomplishment is that of being a lawyer for Monsanto. I said, sir, we have a classic example of the fox guarding the hen house. I know that's not your fault. I know you can't fix it, but thank you for at least addressing my question. I stuck out my hand. He shook my hand. He nodded his head, got a little smile on his face, and walked out the door. What do you see in this picture? Combine dust. A combine which is combining genetically engineered glyphosate sprayed corn in Iowa and kicking up a lot of dust. A gentleman I know in northwest Iowa noticed a lot of dust in his brother's Liberty Link corn, more so than his own non-GMO corn. He noticed a lot of dust in his father's Roundup Ready corn. So one morning he cleans off a spot on the combine. They combine the Liberty Link corn. He goes back that night and he gets a dust sample and he puts it in a bag and he marks it. Did the same thing with the glyphosate corn. Then he noticed a lot of dust in his hog building. He custom feeds hogs and that dust was accumulating in there, and he thought, well, I'll just take a sample of that and send it in. So he sent all these samples to Midwest Labs in Omaha and asked them to do a mold count and identification. When they sent back the results, they said, warning, anyone working in an environment where there's dust at levels above 1,000 CFUs per gram should have a protective breathing device. I'll start with the hog dust. 14,000 CFUs per gram. Of that, 1,000 is Aspergillus niger, and 10,000 is Aspergillus species other, 3,000 is Penicillium. Again, 1,000 was the warning sign for protecting yourself. The Liberty Link corn, 7,200,000. Total count of that 7 million is Aspergillus species, 200,000 is Penicillium. The Roundup Ready glyphosate tolerant corn is 15,600,000. Of that, it is all Aspergillus species. I'm told by my PhD research friends that have the knowledge in this arena that the Aspergillus species is potentially one of the more dangerous molds to deal with. There's nothing scientific about this, but at harvest time, when the corn and the soybeans in Iowa are being harvested, you see a lot of dust. We have, Dr. McNeil, Bob Stripe, myself, we've noticed a few things. People have respiratory issues as a result of breathing this dust. Depending on the year, it can be almost epidemic. One year, we had perfect growing conditions for maximum production of the mycotoxins in the soil and the bad organisms that are going to cause the mold and mycotoxin production to be in overdrive. At the college where my wife works, just about how many percentage of the people ended up with pneumonia with their respiratory issue? Not scientific. This is an interactive slide. I need you to participate with me. Do you recognize any of the names in the center of the circle?
Yes.
Have you ever seen a commercial in a magazine or on TV that says, if you cannot afford your medication costs, contact us, we have a program to assist you? Yes. That commercial sponsored by AstraZeneca. Have you ever heard of atrazine? Yes. One of the oldest herbicides in corn production in our country. That is made by AstraZeneca Syngenta. Did you know that AstraZeneca Syngenta is the #4 producer of genetically engineered crops in the world? When you see or hear Bayer, what is the first thing you think of? Have you ever heard of Bayer Crop Science, the makers of Aztec insecticide, Liberty herbicide, and genetically engineered crops? When you see or hear Pfizer Pharmacia Upjohn, what do you represent with that conglomerate group of companies? Pharmaceutical. Did you know they were the sole parent holding company of Monsanto at one point in time, and now they're still connected in a way? So we have established the fact that all the companies in the center of the circle are in the pharmaceutical and chemical business. We will start with chemical. I want you to give me one word that you would use to describe a chemical that kills a weed or an insect, and you are describing this chemical to a 5-year-old child. What one word might you use?
Poison.
Poison.
Okay, we're using poison to raise crops. What do we raise crops for? Cereal and grain. What does the bulk of the grain get fed to? Livestock. So, in using this poison on the crops, if there were to be a residual effect, do you think it would be positive or negative? If there is a negative effect that might affect the grain, you feed the grain to the livestock don't feel good, who might you call for help? When the veterinary comes out, what might he suggest you give your livestock to help them feel better? If you want your livestock to grow faster and you can have a lower cost of production, what might you give them to grow faster? What do we raise livestock for? Who eats the meat? If there's a residual adverse effect from this poison that's used in crops that might affect the grain, that could affect the livestock, is there a chance that it would affect the meat?
Yes. Yes.
If the people eat the meat and they don't feel good, where do they go? After you go to the doctor, where might he send you with a piece of paper with his autograph on it? Does that present a positive cash flow for the companies in the center of the circle? I would like to reiterate, all of the scientists that I am privileged to work with in varying degrees have the same belief and thought process relative to genetic engineering. The potential is good if and when the technology is refined, perfected, and implemented as they purport it to be. We want to improve specifically yield. We want to improve specifically nutrition content. We have foreign proteins that are indigestible with potential allergenic effects. We have crops deficient in nutrient content because of strong chelation from chemicals. We have increases in growth of opportunistic fungi causing plant and animal disease, increased environmental challenges such as dust, increased mold and mycotoxin levels, increased need for antibiotics, increases in immune system challenges, inflammation and disease, as well as increases in respiratory problems. We are told by the proponents of GMOs that we need this to feed the growing population. With the current state and status of where things are at, what do you think?
No way.
Do you want to feed this to your family, your children, and your grandchildren?
No way.
What can you do? A friend of mine in Irvine, California sent me this picture. This sign was posted on the schoolyard where her children play. Warning, pesticide treated area. The #1 glyphosate produced chemical in the world. How many people have ever used that in a ready-to-use handy little squirt bottle you pick up at one of these fast box stores, and you go out and you spray a weed in the crack of the sidewalk and the weed dies? I have a suggestion. First, I would ask you think about what happens to the residue that doesn't hit the plant that's on the cement when it rains like it is today. Where's that residue go? And then an alternative. My mother always had a teapot on the stove. She would fill that up with water full and turn the burner on high and let her sit there until she whistled. Then she'd pick that thing up and she'd go outside and she would pour that boiling hot water on all them weeds in the crack in the sidewalk. She'd go back in the house and set the teapot on the stove. If she needed to, she'd fill it again. But then she'd go out and she'd pull them weeds out just like this. They came out real easy after that boiling water hit them. It has some effect on it. But amazingly, it doesn't run down and affect anything after it's done. If you would like to further educate yourself on this subject, I strongly recommend this book. It is a very good broad stroke picture of the whole topic of genetic engineering. Seeds of Destruction by William Engdahl. Very well documented book. I only found one slight little thing that I would take issue with. The rest of it seemed to be right on the money. Here's another book that I would suggest you read, especially if you are going to become a mother or a grandparent. It's entitled Our Stolen Future. I have purchased many copies of this book used online for a penny and paid $3.99 for the shipping. Now, they may have a run on this if anybody follows the suggestion after my recommending this at every tour we've done in Washington in the last 2 weeks. But it's worth the money. It's not a difficult book to read scientifically. It talks about the endocrine disrupting capabilities of synthetic chemicals. DDT is a big picture in people's mind when you think of chemical and problems. DDT caused problems at parts per trillion and parts per billion. All the glyphosate residue levels are in parts per million. And that's what we focused on to this point in time in the research. The first research with parts per trillion levels of glyphosate was published out of Thailand this year, and they documented the fact that glyphosate residues in parts per trillion was feeding the tumors to cause breast cancer at an excellent rate. I like to end this, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The author.
Oh, Theo Colburn. TheoColborn.
Would you say anything about fludoxylene?
Pardon?
Would you know what fludoxylene?
Yeah, I do, but I'm not as familiar with that as I am with this. I put out a lot of heavy information, so I got to give you something to leave with a smile on your face. And hope. A friend of ours in Illinois sent these pictures. He put conventional ears of corn in a sack in the warehouse, and right next to it there was some GMO corn in a sack in the warehouse. They sat side by side, and he took the pictures. A friend of mine in Ohio sent me this picture. He had a conventional ear of corn he put on that tree, and he had a genetically engineered ear of corn he put on that tree, and he took this picture 9 months later. What do the mice and the squirrels know that the scientists don't know? A positive alternative. In 2012, we had the worst drought in the Midwest since 1998. A man that I know in Nebraska sent me this picture. This is a non-GMO, biologically produced farm with soybeans growing in it. Here's the fence line. This is a genetically engineered glyphosate farmed farm. They missed the second pass of glyphosate. That's why this first row is green here for a little ways. I don't know the yield there. Now I'm going to take you to Iowa. This is a gravel road that separates this field from this field. You can see the yellow and the brown. Here, that is a genetically engineered triple stack glyphosate raised cornfield. It was chopped for silage because the yield wasn't good enough to harvest it. This farm is on a complete biological crop production program, has been for many years, and they do not use genetically engineered crops. If I went across the fence, this field, imagine we go over here across the fence, there's a field of triple stack corn that was appraised at 27 bushels an acre and chopped for silage. If we come this direction, there's a field of triple stack genetically engineered corn sprayed with glyphosate that was appraised at 12 bushels per acre chopped for silage. I heard this was 28, but I don't know that for a fact. So I know 12, I know 27, maybe 28. This field settled with the crop insurance at 109 bushels per acre and harvested it all for grain. So they tell us without this technology, we can't feed the world.